Okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Luis Sala. I'm Alfresco's Director of Technology Alliances. My Twitter handle is that. You can get the slides and rate this session by following that URL. I'll leave it there for just a few seconds. Some of you may have attended my session yesterday about where we reviewed different mobile development options and so forth. So you might see actually a couple slides that are, in a sense, repeating the same message from that time. But basically, in my responsibility, I'm working with a lot of technology companies that where we're trying to grow out the Alfresco ecosystem of apps that integrate into Alfresco and use content in new and different ways. So in a sense, I like to kind of say that it's going beyond the document library, going beyond just documents, and using Alfresco as a platform for content-centric applications. So hopefully you visited that page and you're downloading the slides right now. So let's just dive right into it. Actually, maybe I'll take a quick little poll. How many of you consider yourselves reasonably savvy JavaScript, HTML types of developers? Good. Yeah, well, I know you are. All right, that's good. Okay, so good. So, good audience. And how many of you are just, really want to learn more about the capabilities and what is it that you can do with HTML5? It sounds, presumably most of you, but for those of you that don't necessarily have some direct experience, you're looking to learn more and so forth, let me know. Raise your hands. Yeah, okay, so it's exactly. Okay, great. Wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about Alfresco as a platform for content-rich applications. I acknowledge that it's a bit of a truism. It's immediately obvious to the casual observer that when we explore the types of apps that we see on most devices, whether it's on your desktop, on your laptop, smartphone, or tablet, we will see most applications center around content in one way or another, and yet what I've observed in my experience is that many developers end up creating their own content management system to manage the content for these apps. I don't know why. I don't know if it's a Silicon Valley thing where hipster programmers in skinny jeans and like thick rimmed glasses just must, kind of like invent their own thing, but they do it. And they're not necessarily always thinking about the life cycle, the content, and whether it's an image or video or actual text content or whatever, the life cycle that it takes as it goes through its evolution, right? So from initial authoring, review, and approval, ultimately publishing, and eventually disposition, pulling it back. And it might sound like I'm talking about records management, but all content pretty much has that life cycle. Eventually, data and information tends to become stale, and so we need to think about birth and death and everything that happens in between, right? And so there are tools like Alfresco and other things that are very well suited to handle these types of situations, and yet I see a lot of wheel reinvention going on. So when I look at Alfresco and think of it as a platform, not just as an application, then I really am looking at Alfresco serving essentially as a content-oriented database. And so we can use things like CMIS, for example, as a standardized protocol by which we access these repository services, where we can insert objects and metadata, where we can query for those objects based on metadata. So give me all products whose color attribute is red. Yes, it sounds a lot like a database query, but that's the whole point. I mean, you're supposed to be able to look for digital assets or related content based on metadata attributes and so forth. And CMIS, I think, can become the backbone for accomplishing these types of results. So we have the CMIS APIs available on premises and in the cloud, and we're basically moving towards this type of standardization. We have mobile SDKs, native SDKs, and I'm working on an experimental JavaScript library, and the URL is right there. You can see a bunch of other experiments. It is a personal project, and we'll talk more about this personal project a little bit later. And then we also do have our developer program that anybody can join. Just go to developer.alfresco.com, sign up for an account, download the SDKs and all that fun stuff, and develop apps. So let's talk a little bit about why HTML5. I believe, and those of you that attended yesterday's session have heard me say native is the way to go. Well, honestly, if you can afford it and if you care about experiences and if you're targeting one platform, there's only one choice, native. But HTML5 is certainly for web-based applications, and I think over the next few years is becoming a very credible platform on top of which you develop content-centric applications. And today it is already, in my opinion, a solid foundation within certain constraints. So first and foremost, this is predicated on having increasingly better, faster JavaScript runtimes. And as we've seen nowadays, with the exception of Microsoft, we're seeing basically new browser updates every like 20 seconds, okay, every few weeks. But this is fueling a lot of innovation, and I like that a lot. Sometimes it kind of comes back and bites us in the tail because you know, sometimes they might introduce a regression or something like that. But for the most part, we're seeing a lot of accelerated development and innovation around web technologies, and this trend, I think, is going to continue for years to come. Eventually, you know, I would say that by this time next year, we'll be using Firefox 210 and, you know, Chrome 2000 or whatever, right? So we're seeing a lot of great stuff there. I would also note that there's been this abundance, this explosion, almost like an algae bloom of you know, which is actually kind of scary because algae blooms tend to kill pretty much everything in the vicinity. But nonetheless, this explosion of JavaScript and CSS and HTML5 frameworks, and they go by a wide variety of different names, and we'll see a couple of them are things like Batman.js. It's real. I mean, it's actually pretty interesting, you know. But underscore, Backbone, Ember, Sprout Core. All these types of like platforms and stuff like that are just becoming ubiquitous, and they all do they do cause some fragmentation, but they're all giving us some great things in terms of developing HTML5 based applications. HTML5 gives us some semantic markups. It changes the markup a little bit, and I think this helps us develop applications that can be a little bit more responsive based on the device that is accessing them. And I think one important thing is basically more device access through a standardized API. And just to note a few, we include web storage, IndexedDB, and things like the file API, allowing a HTML5 based app to directly access your file system within a sandbox type of a setting. So far, so good? Awesome. So now let's talk about single page apps. Pretty much everything I'm going to be discussing here, it falls under the umbrella of single page apps. And I'm not saying that everything should be coded into one HTML page or something along those lines, but generally speaking, we're not going to do a lot of request response driven type of development where we have some kind of say a servlet, you know, excuse me, a JSP type of a backend or PHP backend always generating some new HTML and markup to represent the next view down the line. Generally speaking, all the views that encompass the application, all the client-side business logic is implemented in JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and is loaded, you know, whether it's lazy loaded through asynchronous module loading or just loaded in one fell swoop, it is residing on the device, okay? So all the presentation and logic is on the device. It's generally aggregated effectively through a single HTML page, and there are tricks to make it, you know, a little bit more performant. And generally speaking, the transaction that occurs between the browser and the backend, whatever that backend might be, is no longer going to be just fetching HTML, but it's really fetching structured data, usually in the form of JSON. But it does not have to be that way. And the single-page apps may include some optimizations, such as asynchronous module loading, which I mentioned previously, and minification and compression, all just to mitigate network latency issues and those types of things. Okay. We've used quite a few single-page apps, both on mobile devices and on the web, and these are just a couple examples that, you know, in the consumer world that we're comfortable and we've used quite a bit. So Gmail, I would say that the doclib component inside Alfresco Share is a fairly good self-contained HTML5 single-page app. Not the whole of Share, because as you know, if you click Wiki, you actually load up a Wiki page that's a separate. Essentially, you're reloading a whole new page. But within the doclib, you can do a lot without page refreshing. And I think that's a good example. But the Twitter web app, Facebook web app are all good examples of HTML5 types of apps. You may have heard me talk about my distinction between frameworks and platforms. This is just for the purposes of the presentation. You may have disagreements or just think of them in different ways, but just for us to all be in sync today. So frameworks, when I talk about frameworks, I'm usually talking about client-side development. And some examples are listed there: Sencha, Ember, Backbone, whatever. And they generally provide you some kind of a model view controller type of a architecture, so that way you can implement client-side MVC. There's a distinction here. We generally, especially for us like legacy Java, JSP type developers and stuff like that, when we think MVC, the model is represented in a database, right? The controller logic is, say, enterprise Java beans or maybe just some Spring beans or something along those lines. And the view is the HTML that the browser is showing you. That is, I guess, a traditional view of MVC. I'm talking about within the client itself, within the browser, there is an internal model that represents the structured data as it's been fetched from whatever the backend is. So it's just a pure data, say an array or a hash map or something along those lines that represents the data you're presenting. Then there is a controller layer that basically handles a lot of the business logic, and that is pure JavaScript or something along those lines that's kind of doing manipulations against the model, and then also talking to the views, and the views themselves are generally responsible for generating whatever markup is required in order to display it on the page. So it's all residing on the browser. You may very well still have a database and some kind of middleware. In fact, we'll talk about this in a moment, doing some additional manipulations on the server end. But when it talks to the browser, it does so with JSON or other structured types of content. A platform is where your business logic resides. And that would be things like your traditional Java stack, or it could be a hosted platform such as Alfresco, Heroku, or any of those types of platforms. And there are many, millions of them, well, maybe hundreds of them. And these are just some examples that tend to focus primarily on consumer, except for Alfresco, and perhaps you could say Heroku has a lot of enterprise use and whatnot. Generally speaking, they'll give you data persistence and server-side logic, hosting and that kind of stuff. All right. So now I'm going to propose an architecture for HTML5 based apps. We all know, especially in the Alfresco world, that we can extend Alfresco by basically going into different layers within Alfresco, whether it's the pure repository and create new web scripts or new Java-based extensions and stuff like that to add new functionality. We can take Alfresco Share and start injecting new functionality into the UI, and a lot of great strides have been made in terms of making the Share user interface far more extensible, and I think that's all great stuff. But sometimes it makes sense to have either a standalone app that fills a specific business need or a specific goal, as opposed to taking Share and then mucking around with it. It just be judicious. But my point is that if you were to consider developing a brand new app from scratch and you think it's justifiable and so forth, then maybe an architecture like this would behoove you because it moves all the custom logic to a completely standalone environment that is independent of Alfresco, and therefore you can do things like insulate yourself from upgrade issues and stuff like that. Because if you were to upgrade an Alfresco environment that already has some customizations that have been deployed to it, you will need to do things like merge in changes or deploy amps to a WAR file and make sure that between version 4.1 and 4.2 of Alfresco that certain ways of injecting functionality into Share haven't changed, and so you have to deal with all that. But if Alfresco is just a headless database that's REST accessible using CMS, and you have some other business logic encapsulated in your own PHP, Node.js, Java environment, then and that takes care of talking to the database and talking to other types of services, you might be in better shape when it comes to upgrading to the latest version of Alfresco to inherit and take benefit of certain capabilities. So in this case, Alfresco is being accessed primarily through the REST services, modifications inside Alfresco kept to a minimum, and all your custom logic is effectively encapsulated in a middleware. And so the stack more or less looks like this. And I would like to note that the middleware would tend to act almost like a proxy, sometimes completely pass through, sometimes it just takes whatever request came in from the server, translates it into whatever it needs to translate it to do its magic, returns the data back to the browser. And so So you might want to do this for a variety of different reasons, but one clear one is actually to deal with cross-origin requests, which would not be doable with some kind of a middleware or proxy layer or something along those lines. Or if you were to support cross-origin resource sharing, which is an internet standard for allowing JavaScript to talk to servers other than the one that, that served up the JavaScript in the first place. It's a security thing. Was that more or less clearish? Okay. So I want to demo a quick little app. And actually, it's going to sound a little weird because this app actually has native code in it. It's actually, it was my first experiment in learning Objective-C, but it does have an HTML5 component. And more importantly, it demonstrates this type of architecture. So it's an app called SkyDrop. It's something that I developed to make it easy for me to share and my colleagues to share files through Alfresco in the cloud from my desktop. So I would not even have to like log into my.alfresco.com and upload a file and all that stuff. It just makes file sharing very easily. So there is a native Mac and Windows app. I wrote the Mac app. My colleague Nathan McMinn wrote the Windows app. And it allows you to drag a file into it. It gets uploaded automatically into Alfresco in the cloud. As it does so, it's going through a Node.js-based middleware, which stores the file into the cloud. It also uses DynamoDB to store a reference to that file and basically generate a short URL for that content. And that's stored in DynamoDB. And then I can share that short URL with my friends and colleagues and whatnot, and they would use a simple HTML5 app to fetch that content. So let's go ahead and show you a quick demonstration of SkyDrop in action. Okay, so switch a few tabs. So let's say I want to share, one of these photographs. We were in Berlin last week, and I ordered my colleague Jerome and I ordered the meat plate for 2, and it could have easily fed 4. And it was the most delicious thing ever. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans love pork, especially during the Christmas season. So this is very appropriate. So let's share this file with a couple friends here. So all I'm going to do here is actually I need to do something here. Sometimes because my resolution gets all kind of reduced here, my SkyDrop icon is hiding somewhere back here, so I think I'm going to need to do a little bit of cleanup. There it is. That's my SkyDrop icon. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my file. So I'm just going to take that file. I'm going to drag it over to SkyDrop, and notice it turns into a little plus sign. And now it's uploading, except that there was an error, probably just a networking thing. That's why it turned red. If it doesn't work, one more time, I will. Let's try one more time here. Come on. There we go. It turned blue, and had I turned my audio on, you would hear a little ding. Just audio and visual cues are all a good thing. In any case, what's just happened is that a short URL has just been pasted onto my browser, onto my clipboard. And so if I were to paste that URL, there it is. I can go there, and I can now download that document. Very simple. Very simple. But it's using those main architectural elements that I described. A middleware that handles the custom sharing types of logic and some of the security precautions that I've taken. It does a lot of encryption and stuff like that. And Alfresco in the cloud as my back end. And then the front ends, which are effectively the SkyDrop native client and the HTML5 app. And so there's that same photograph, and my delicious pork dish. Great. Yes? The HTML5-ish there will be the client app where I downloaded it from. It actually talks to the middleware using Ajax and everything else to fetch the data. Also, there's some, as I said, there's some encryption going on because I wanted to be really paranoid about the backend repository. I want to make sure that I protect the Alfresco repository and other people's data and whatnot. So that's why I also disclaimed it as being somewhat of a counterexample in that there's a native component. And actually, the native component has a lot more code to it than the HTML5. But it still uses the same multi-tier architecture. And that was the key. But we'll see some more applications now. I'm going to show you pure HTML5 applications that also use the same basic architecture, including a middleware, but are pure HTML5 and do a lot more than just allow me to download a single file. But that's a perfectly valid question. So we saw SkyDrop. Now I'm going to talk to you about one specific JavaScript framework. I have a soft place in my heart, for this framework. It's called Ember, and Ember is the spiritual successor to a framework called Sprout Core. Sprout Core is actually in active development and use by Apple. Apple's iWork suite makes use of, I said iWork, I meant iCloud service makes use of Sprout Core. There's a full email client functionality, for example, that's all Sprout Core based, really good stuff. And Ember takes a lot of the concepts behind Sprout Core, and I'll show you what those concepts are, and makes it a little bit more lightweight and gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you do. But it sacrifices UI elements. In other words, it's not a widget library. There are many frameworks that include widget libraries that look native, for example, or have a specific look and feel. Sprout Core basically says, use whatever you want and make it look however you want, right? And so, anyway. So Ember is described as being a framework for ambitious apps. And indeed, you can build some really solid applications with this. And if you go to Ember.js.com, you will see a list of different apps and companies that are using Ember in production types of situations. And one of them is Square. So anytime a Square seller basically wants to view their analytics as to how many sales they had in the day and stuff like that, they're really accessing it through an Ember app that in turn also uses other JavaScript libraries such as D3.js, which is a data visualization library, in order to view these beautiful reports that update in real time. It's just really, really awesome. And Ember is a very good framework for this. So it implements a client-side MVC type of architecture, similar to what I described earlier. And more importantly, though, it borrows a concept from Cocoa called key value observing. And that allows us to automatically bind the UI and the controller logic and the data model such that if any of them change, for example, if you change if you have a list of things in the UI and maybe they're editable, right, and you edit one of them, it automatically updates the backend data model. Okay, so you don't have to actually trap the event when say the mouse, or the cursor, moves out of the field or whatever, and then persist that. It takes care of it for you, so you can watch objects and their properties and be automatically and be assured that the values are always going to be in sync. And we're going to see that. I'm going to show you a very quick little demo app that demonstrates or begins to demonstrate that particular concept. But the point is that it keeps the models and the views in perfect sync. It also employs something called computed properties, and computed properties are a way of basically taking an existing data model and do things like have virtual properties that are actually the result of performing calculations or operations on existing properties. So for example, and you'll see this in a moment, if I have a JavaScript object that represents my model for a person, and it contains a property for the first name and a property for the last name, but I want to sometimes be able to do things like print out and display the full name, which is the concatenation of the first and last name, I can define a computed property that's a function that concatenates the two, and using key value observing, it actually observes the two variables or properties that it depends on, and whenever those get updated, it performs every calculation. And this is a performance thing, because we don't want to perform the computation every single time somebody fetches that person object. We want to do it only when it changes, and otherwise we will cache the result. And so it does some really neat things in that respect. Anyway, we'll see that in a moment. It employs template-driven views using a templating language called Handlebars. It's basically HTML with some curly braces wherever you want dynamic elements to be included. Handlebars is described as a logic-less templating language. So unlike PHP, where you can basically intersperse tons of code inside your view, Handlebars is trying to basically say, you know what, I'm going to give you helpers to do things like iterate through things and print out values and maybe bind a button to an action in a controller. And that's about it. It can do a little bit more than that. But the point is that you're not supposed to implement a lot of logic in your UI, and Handlebars enforces that. Okay? So I would also say that Ember.js and Sprout Core, for that matter, are rather opinionated about certain things, just like the Cocoa framework and the Mac and many other frameworks have opinions about certain things. They basically say, for my framework, this is the right way to do things. Okay? Another thing that's awesome but can be a little overwhelming at times is that Ember encourages the use of state machines to encapsulate just the flow of the app, you know, how you move from screen A to screen B, how you persist state for every given view and so forth. And so it uses the concept of routers, which automatically map state to a URL, so that as your browser URL changes, all it's really doing is persisting the application state at that point in time. And so, for example, you might have a URL that's, you know, acme.com/products/ you know, whatever, Transformers, right? You know, the toy, and /Optimus Prime, right? And so that URL path would actually map the Transformers field to the product family, and then Optimus Prime to a particular toy, right? That would be the idea. And so that's your application state, and it can be encapsulated using a finite state machine. Basically, is what it amounts to. And by the way, that's my comp sci. What little I remember about comp sci coming out right there. And you also create transitions. Wow, that sounds a lot like workflow. And the fact is, it's almost a little bit like BPM workflows as well. So there's transitions from one state to another, and that's how you encapsulate your application logic. And so anyway, I think that's really cool, and it's something that I would encourage you all to do within any application. Start thinking of your app as really just a series of states, right? That you move from, you know, that you move from one to the other, and that would help you write better code in general. And there's a great white paper, by the way, on using state charts, you know, as a means for encapsulating state. Okay, enough about that. So here's a simple Ember app, and I'm actually not 100% sure it'll execute as is, but it's about 95% correct for sure. You know, it shows you the basic thing. The first thing is I want to create a namespace for my app. So I have a variable called my app, and I basically tell Ember to create the namespace for me. And it's just ember.application.create. So Ember uses extend and create as the methods for either subclassing, that would be extend, or initializing, constructing, right, a new object using create, okay, instantiating, right? So I am instantiating an object of type application, or Ember application might be more appropriate, and into my app. So that creates, an empty namespace. And now within the my app namespace, I'm going to add an object of type Ember object, and assign it to the president property. And this object has a property called first name, a property called last name, and it's set to these values, and a computed property called full name. And all you do is supply a function to these computed properties that basically do whatever manipulation you need to do. And in this case, it uses the this.get notation. It uses .get and .set. By the way, Ember, in order for key value observing and data bindings to work, you have to access your properties using get and set. It's a contrivance that's required for this to work well. If you just do this.firstName, you can still update the property. However, any observers will not be notified of the change, and therefore breaks your app. So you do have to get used to this little bit. But honestly, it's not that bad. And what you get out of it is, of course, well worth it. But in any case, I'm going to get my first name property. I'm going to concatenate it with a space, and then my last name property. And that's what I'm going to return. And by flagging it as a property, I effectively am making it cacheable. But more importantly, I can declare who I depend on, or in other words, what properties I depend on. So it says, I depend on first name and last name. This automatically establishes another binding that watches these two, and if they ever change, then it triggers a recomputation. Okay? That's what I described a little bit earlier. So I think that's simple, it's very elegant, and the power, as you build bigger and bigger apps that do more and more with the data, I think cannot be understated. And down here we have a handlebars template that's very simplistic. Handlebars templates can be expressed in a variety of different ways, but for simple apps, you would just have a script tag and set its type to text/extension x, dash handlebars. And right now I'm just outputting some basic text, but here are your curly braces, 2 curly braces, and then I'm going to say, hey, let's grab the full name property of my app.president. And that's it. And notice I'm not using this.get or anything like that because this is automatically handled by the templating engine. It's actually translated into a proper bindings-aware get and set type of a call. Does this make sense? Reasonably readable? It should work. All right, cool. Now, I've talked about Ember. Now I'm going to talk about a personal project of mine and something that I could really use some contributions on. And it's a JavaScript library for Alfresco that I'm calling AlfJS. So I'm going to jump actually to a separate presentation that I have on this particular subject. And so here we go. So AlfJS is a JavaScript client library for Alfresco. And it's well suited for browser-based apps. But the way that I developed it, it actually also works in Node.js, so some server-side JavaScript runtimes. And it has some very basic design principles, those being that it's intended to be standalone, so it has no external dependencies. It should be easy to use and easy to customize. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to use AlfJS. First, go to github.com/alfrescolab/alfjs, and you can pick up the latest copy. Come to think of it, I don't think this download link, I don't think I have a build hosted there, so you're going to have to grab the source. But I'll make sure that I put up a build soon. And you download that build, unpack it, and you can start coding. So AlfJS just uses the concept of connection, and the connection is just really configuration that encapsulates things like your hostname, login, and password, and all these other little properties about your Alfresco server. And so you initialize the connection using that, and then you say, okay, let's go ahead and log in, and you'll see that in a moment. But before I go on, let's talk a little bit about callbacks. Is anybody not familiar with JavaScript callbacks and asynchronous callbacks? Okay, good. So you know how callbacks work. AlfJS makes use of success callbacks and failure callbacks. I'm actually thinking of changing this to follow a slightly different model, and instead I'm just going to pass along an error object if an error ever occurs. And so that way you only have one callback essentially, and then you look in, when you're executing your callback, you can just say if error is not undefined or null or whatever, or if error is defined, then obviously an error occurred, handle the exception, otherwise keep going. Anyway, that's more of something I'd like to do in the future. So, anyway, so that's the way it would look as far as a callback is concerned, but let's move on to the login. So in the current model, I call once the connection has been initialized, I call the login function, and I pass along a success callback and an error callback. And if it succeeds, then I will do something. In this case, using jQuery, in this case, I'm just putting up success somewhere, right? And I can grab the ticket from the connection. So if you're familiar with Alfresco authentication, there's ticket-based authentication. And currently, AlfJS uses tickets. I'm actually thinking of also getting rid of that and using just basic auth the whole time. But the cool thing about this way of presenting the library is that there's this rather conspicuous looking run example icon or button right there. So this is an HTML5 presentation that actually has AlfJS loaded in it, and it's already pre-configured to hit my Alfresco server. So in theory, assuming I haven't broken anything, I hit that run example, and we're actually doing a live call against AlfJS, and it's saying, hey, here's the ticket, right? So AlfJS works. Yay. So if you wanted to fetch sites, you call get sites. And similarly, because you're going to get a list of things, you might want to iterate through each item. In this case, you're seeing things like underscore.each. I'm using a library called underscore.js to just make it easy to iterate through things and whatnot. So I'm iterating through the list and appending them to the list. And here's a fancy version of that. I'm going to use tables instead. Same basic idea, however. I'm getting this a list of sites that are on that particular server, and I'm also outputting some of the properties. So, I get back an item and item.title and item.whatever description, and whether it's public and so forth. So far, so good? The pattern repeats itself. So if you want to fetch documents, you just call get doc list, and you give it basically a destination. Right? So what folder, what site you want to list, and move on, and keep going. So you can fetch a node and its properties, and this example is a little bit different in that I just output the JSON structure that comes back. That's what you're seeing there. So it's a read-only library at the moment. I want it to be read-write, and I started developing this probably about almost a year ago now, And it's not my day job, so unfortunately progress is slow. But I intend to make this a read-write library. And I have a dream that I can encapsulate one day all the CMS functionality and the share functionality, what are codenamed the slingshot services, into this all-encompassing library so that if I wanted to, I could write a new version of share or something akin to it using this one unified library for accessing Alfresco. But at the rate I'm going, I'll be dead before that happens. But let's go ahead and put it all together and show you a real-ish type of an app. This app is called CoPresent. It is a very simple prototype that I developed. And what you're seeing here is really just a browser window with two iframes. The purpose of this app, by the way, is to make it easy for us to collaborate in a meeting and watch the same document, watch the same presentation, or whatever it is, together on our iPads, on our laptops, et cetera. So I designed this using a responsive layout, a responsive UI, and it uses AlfJS to access the document library and so forth. And you could you'll probably break it, but if you're on a desktop browser or whatever, if you go to copresent.us, you might be able to follow along with me and whatnot. But here's the basics. By the way, I've tested primarily on Chrome. I don't know and cannot guarantee if it'll work on other browsers. But on the left, I'm going to say I'm the presenter. I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation. So I'm going to supply my Alfresco credentials and log in. So, by the way, the UI here happens to be using Twitter Bootstrap, but it is an Ember.js application. And so I iterate through the list of sites. It's the exact same sites we saw in that demo previously. So I go into the CoPresent folder, and I can dig down to subfolders and so forth. And I can go back and forth, so all that works, right? And I'm going to pick this presentation here. And what's going to happen now is that the Alfresco server is going to convert that document, a PowerPoint, into a PDF. And then I'm going to render it. Now, I didn't scale the rendered version, so in an ideal situation, I would detect how wide this little frame is and then scale it accordingly. But nonetheless, you can see that the first slide is indeed there and so forth, right? Oops. So anyway, the other thing I'd like to call your attention to is right here. I get a little meeting code. It's a 3-letter meeting code. It is case sensitive, so if you happen to be following along with me, you will need to type capital VPI as in the viewer experience, right? And you hit join. And what's going to happen now is that we're going to fetch that document and render it in this view. And it takes a little bit of time for that to happen. There we go. Now, if I'm driving, I'm the pilot, right? And by the way, this is inspired by an app called Idea Flight for iOS, except I implemented a basic clone in HTML5. I can just start paginating. Eventually, I would do swipes, of course. But notice that the views are kept in sync, right? So we can now all look at the exact same presentation, the exact same slides in real time. It's a very simple example, but I hope you can see how useful it would be. We're all in a meeting. We're sharing a document. Instead of squinting at a screen like you guys are right now, maybe you can look at it right there in front of you. Anyway, so there's AlfJS and an Ember.js app kind of together. All right, so let's move on. I really need help, and I'm going to skip this part, but there are instructions on the AlfJS site that show you how to clone and build the library. And I highly recommend that if you have an improvement, just submit a pull request against this and help me out. There's also an issue tracker that you can kind of contribute to. So anyway, so that's that. Any questions about AlfJS before I proceed? Yes?
Do you plan on implementing a sort of smaller version like CMS.js or the rest of the...
Right. So the question is, do I intend to implement something like for CMS? And the answer is yes, and you help me, right? So yes, I do want to have a standalone CMIS library and a standalone kind of like share-oriented library. And then AlfJS in some future would actually aggregate the two and be smart enough to route between CMS and Alfresco depending on what you want to do. But that's kind of the dream. So the next thing I'd like to show you is an app, a built-in Sprout core, and developed by our friends at App Innovation. This is an app that was built in roughly a week, a little over a week, right? And this is, I basically said, I really want you guys to develop an HTML5 app that, you know, talks to Alfresco and so forth. And so let's go ahead and pull up, start my AirPlay here. I think there we go. So there's the app. And so the general idea here was talk to Alfresco and give me a different way of viewing share sites, right? And very visual. I had kind of used Evernote as an example, make it easy to capture and discover information, and but basically gave them full, you know, leeway as to how this is going to actually work. And they took it and flew, and that was a good thing because, I mean, I couldn't possibly project manage this or product manage this from Germany. So, so anyway, so here we go. I'm going to log in. So, yeah, yep, log in, and then the password. Remember, it's about a week's worth of work. So it's going to do things like ask me to authenticate one more time. It's a cookie setting thing, but I'm sure we can fix that soon enough. And so what you're seeing here is a nice little tool that allows me to do things like view recent blog entries, and it's, you know, fairly responsive. You know, it handles touch very nicely, right? I can, you know, view specific documents, for example. And there's that content, not bad. Hit back. Get my view back. I can, you know, access, you know, shortcuts. I assume these are shortcuts, right? Yes, right, okay. Except that there's no back button here. Darn it. Oh, it's a new window, yeah, except that I just did this as a home screen app, so I'm going to have to actually close this and reopen it. This is, you know, live demo. This is the first time this is demoed out there, right? So, by the way, that's a Sprout Core logo, and that's why it appears like that. So let's go ahead and log in one more time. I do apologize for that. I should not, oops, I should not go off the reservation too much. There's always a magic click, or in this case, tap sequence, you know, that you want to use so that the app doesn't necessarily break. But in any case, there's that again. Once again, because I did the home screen app, the things like cookies and stuff like that are not being persisted unless you use specific HTML5 APIs to kind of handle that. So SC. All right, great. So a really cool feature about this is that, you know, I want to make it easy to share, right? Capture and share information. So if I hit the Share tab, I can do things like create a new blog post and just kind of paste it in very easily. But I'm going to just do one feature here, and that's post a photo. Now, it just so happens that iOS 6 does allow you to access the photo library and the camera. So if I choose Upload Photo, iOS is responsible for rendering that little take photo or choose existing. So I'm going to try to take a photo here, and here's where, you know, I'm blocking the view. Ah, okay, that's holy frijoles. Okay, this is just weird. All right, and take a little picture. There we go. I'm going to use that, and so there's the photo, and I hit save. And it's being uploaded to the server. That's pretty cool. An HTML5 app just accessed the camera, you know. And so easy capture, easy sharing of information. And so it uploaded, and now I see that last picture I took right here, except that it's upside down. Version 2 will have the ability to rotate photos. So I'm going to leave it at that. But do you think you guys are going to open source it? Okay, I think it would be great because it's a great example of number one of Sprout Core, and number two, just alternate UIs to Alfresco share. All right, so thank you very much, guys. I have 5 minutes. I thought you were going to give me a 10-minute warning, or did I not see you? I didn't see you. See, this is my fault. That's okay. We're actually in great shape here. So, there are other demo apps, and I encourage you to drop by the different pods, and I'll note those here. So I showed you CoPresent. I showed you Synapse. Deja has, who are sponsors here, has a pretty neat little touch-oriented HTML5 viewer for documents and does some basic annotations. It's still a work in progress, but it's actually pretty slick. So EduWorks is also here, and so Fritz is going to be demoing 2 apps, one called Russell, and then the other one called Concept One. And they, aside from being just really slick little HTML5 apps, it also talks to their technology, which does a lot of like semantic analysis and of the documents, and so does some really cool things with content. Russell is primarily oriented towards like courseware type of stuff, SCORM type documents and whatnot, and then concept 1 is more about the semantic analysis and so forth. So check that out. Also check out MicroStrategies, their booth. They're showing off a Windows 8 app that's also basically HTML5 and talks to Alfresco using JavaScript and so forth. So it's worth looking at there. So some best practices for your HTML5 apps. Use responsive layouts. If you don't know much about responsive layout, just Google it. But yeah, depending on the CSS and UI framework that you use, they do make provisions for handling things like different screen sizes, different orientations, and all that kind of stuff. So Twitter Bootstrap, for example, and other CSS grids take advantage, give you that. The larger your project gets, the more JavaScript libraries you can have, or actually not just libraries, but your code will be spread out in different places because it makes sense from an organizational perspective. Instead of having one uber JavaScript file that's 20,000 lines long or whatever, you might want to split out your views into one directory, your controllers into another, and your models and all that stuff. So there's tools like Yeoman. Go to yeoman.io. It's a really great tool for managing large, complex JavaScript projects. And it's actually developed by Google. And it's a really neat app. Yeoman itself actually leverages another much simpler tool called Grunt, and you can check that out. And if you have a small to medium-sized project, and if you're a Rails, Ruby on Rails type of developer, there's Rake Pipeline, which can do some concatenation and minification of JavaScript and so forth. I do recommend that you use state charts, and the HTML5 based browsers nowadays give you the ability to push events, basically, or push state into the browser history bar, or whatever, the address bar, and the API itself is called push state. And so doing that allows you to basically have human-readable URLs, even though you're not actually fetching real web pages, right? And so, and with that, you can then bookmark the app. You can basically bookmark a specific view within the app, and that can be a very valuable feature. One major mobile optimization, and you'll learn this as you kind of develop and so forth, is control the viewport size. If you have a mobile app, you don't necessarily want to allow pinch zoom. So I do recommend that you find out the best viewport settings for your particular app. And I do recommend that you limit yourself to basic touch events. Touch event handling within HTML5 is still very, very crude, primarily because the HTML5 as an API lacks real good gesture recognition. It doesn't, you have to implement your own pinch zoom type of logic, to recognize that. And the more touches you're tracking, the harder it gets. But simple swipes are generally easy to build. And there are JavaScript libraries that implement some basic gesture recognition that you might be able to take advantage of. So the next thing is I'd like to inspire you with some basic ideas. And when I spoke to the App Innovation guys, I basically categorized the types of apps into 3 basic buckets. These are the themes, I think, that revolve around any kind of collaborative, content-centric application. Apps that facilitate discovery. And that could be, capture. Let's start with capture. And that could be like an Evernote for the enterprise. I don't know about you guys, but I use the Evernote bookmark, the bookmark lid or the Chrome extension all the time. I find a web page that I like, I hit Evernote. Evernote is great for capture. And it is also great for discovery, which is the second theme. But for discovery, I think Pinterest is a great example. Very visual, very easy to discover new things. And so can we come up with Pinterest for teams, right? And things that facilitate sharing. That's the third theme. Anything makes it easier to disseminate information, get everybody in sync, in line with one another. So for example, something like a virtual product catalog or a showcase that allows me to share information with my customer, with my partners, with my team members. So that kind of stuff. And I talked a little bit about this. The grand unified vision of Alfresco JavaScript libraries, right? And so eventually I would love to move the stuff that's currently in AlfJS into more like a share.js type of a thing that's very specific to the share slingshot services. And then we have CMS.js, and then AlfJS is just really just a shell of sorts with some routing logic smart enough to do this. But I cannot do this type of thing alone. As I said, it's not my full-time job, and I could use any assistance anybody could offer. Really, seriously, just drop me a line. So I'll leave you some parting thoughts. I think Alfresco is a viable platform for content-centric applications. I think with all the frequent updates that we're getting in HTML5 browsers and so forth, there's a lot of constant improvement. Responsive design isn't too hard, but you do need to test on different devices and different form factors, so do keep that in mind. And I think with your help, we can make like my vision of a unified library a reality, and also just make viable, business-oriented, content-centric applications a reality. Once again, download the slides, rate the session. Please give me 20 stars if that's at all possible. And thank you very much. We can answer questions maybe after we're done here. Thank you.